Welcome to the Omnibus Show, a program for people who are interested in everything, conversations on a wide variety of subjects. And now your host, Dave Gibbs.
Hello, and welcome to this edition of the Omnibus Show. Today, we are in Feinstein's at the Hotel Carmichael in Carmel, Indiana. I'd like to welcome today's guest, Eric Nevins, the host and producer of the Halfway There podcast, a Christian podcast where he interviews Christians about their spiritual journeys, and he's also the founder of the Christian Podcasters Association. Welcome, Eric. It's great to have you here today.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to go right into it and discuss with you, or you tell us about your journey to building your podcast, Halfway There, and how you've built on that.
Yeah, well, so it was actually quite the journey because it took me 2 years to start Halfway There. The short version of the story is I thought I was going to be a pastor, and it took me 9 years. I crammed a 3-year degree into 9 years. It took me a while to get that done. And then I graduated during the middle of the downturn and ended up not entering pastoral ministry and finding myself working in the financial world, which I did not particularly enjoy. But that's where I was. And I got a job where I had to actually work for a living. I had to click buttons, bouncing people's checks. So I like to say I was a bouncer. And I was, ruining somebody's day for a living. And but to entertain myself, I started listening to podcasts, and I found a ton of people. They're kind of I would consider them some of the luminaries of online business: Michael Hyatt and Amy Porterfield, Pat Flynn, John Lee Dumas. There's others that I listen to a lot who really kind of inspired me and made me think I could probably do this. It was something I studied spiritual formation as part of my Master of Divinity because I always had this question of how do we grow in Christ? What does that actually look like? And I wanted to still contribute to that conversation. So in 2014, when I was listening to all these podcasts, I started imagining what would that be like? What could I do that would actually contribute to the conversation and help shape a different idea about really what the Christian spiritual experience is like. When I was a kid, maybe this is like the same for you. The story was always, my life was terrible, then I met Jesus, and now my life is great, right? Which is awesome, except for all the other stuff that happens in life. The spiritual journey isn't always like that. And so that's what the story I wanted to tell, and I set out to do it. It took me a couple of years. I finally hired a coach, Tim Morris, who's out in Ohio. And he was actually one of my classmates at seminary. He was a coach, and he helped me kind of get over those mental barriers to get started and to just release it before it was ready, get it going and start sharing. So that was kind of how I got started.
Well, that's great. And now you've had quite a few hundred programs that you've gotten into.
Yeah, today I just published episode number 333, and then there's a bunch of bonus episodes. So we published about 350 episodes so far on that show. And if you'd have told me that, so we've been doing about 6.5 years. If you'd have told me that back then, I would have been maybe I might have laughed at you and thought, wow, that's incredible. But that's where we are. I've committed to doing 10 years of Halfway There. That's my goal. So we've got another 150 episodes or so to go, and 170. So until we get to 10 years, episode 500, we'll keep trucking. I think this is a really interesting question because I said in a meeting of my podcasters recently that I'm pretty satisfied with Halfway There. So one of the things I was concerned at the time was that I didn't feel like I'd made any real impact on the world. I mean, certainly there were people who loved me and cared about me, and I had friends who I would help, but I didn't feel like there was anything that I had contributed. And so that one of the driving motivations for me on that show was to to contribute something to the spiritual formation conversation. I literally do think a lot, very often when I'm editing and working on the show, about how it's going to be perceived, let's say 100 or 200 years from now. I know that seems maybe a little grandiose, but if you think about some of the artifacts that we have from people like the reformers, from saints, and in other traditions, those things turn out to be really valuable. And I think about my show a little bit in that way. Maybe somebody will be listening to it. I'm not going to pay the bill forever for hosting, right? But my hope is that 100 or 200 years from now, somebody else will be listening to it, trying to figure out what was life with God like in the 21st century.
Well, that's great, because one of the challenges of our times, I think, is the narrative of reality. Mm-hmm. And you have a lot of people saying a lot of different things. And it's great to have all of these articles and podcasts that we have so that people can go back in the future and really get an understanding from primary sources.
Well, I was going to add to that, because I think we have to, when you think about research and the ways that we know things, right, from the past, we do it by looking at artifacts, right? So I think of every single episode that I produce as an artifact of somebody's life. It's a snapshot. It's not people evolve and grow and change after they've done an interview with me. I could point to numerous examples, but it is an artifact of our time, and I think that just lends a little bit of weight to it as I go.
Sure. Now, you've had some well-known guests like Os Guinness, a cultural critic, and the writer Andrew Klavan.
Yeah. And
you've had a number of other people. What would you say are some of the milestones?
Yeah.
In, either people or topics. This is a spiritual journey, so it's very personal for people. But what would you say were milestones along the way?
Yeah. There are a couple that stand out to me. I think the very first one was getting to 1,000 downloads. You got to remember, I launched in 2016 when most people didn't even know what a podcast was. In fact, a couple of my first guests were like, "You're going to do what with this audio that you're recording?" It's like, "No, I'm going to put it on the internet and then people are going to listen to it." Oh, okay. So it took a lot longer than maybe it takes for somebody today to get that, because online content wasn't as popular as it is now. But that getting to 1,000 downloads seemed to take forever. It was probably 3 months, maybe 4 months. It took a really long time, and my wife was very happy when I reached that. She was like, "Okay, good, you finally made it." So that was a big one for me. I think hitting episode number 100, I interviewed Aaron Nyquist, who is the husband of Shauna Nyquist, who's a popular writer. And he's a writer himself. He had a book called Eternal Current, it was called, about the kind of all the different streams of Christianity that you can explore. I thought that was a really good one for that particular one. Having Os Guinness on the show was a huge milestone, because it was Os Guinness who actually inspired me to go in this direction, even though he didn't know it. There was a book he wrote called A Free People's Suicide. So before this, two things. I was, one, not a very good preacher. I did not enjoy that particular medium, not the one for me for sharing content. And I also was really into politics. I enjoy presidential politics. I have an ambition to read a biography of every U.S. president. I've gotten up to Andrew Jackson, but there's no audiobooks of Martin Van Buren, so I have to take that one a little slower. So I love that, and I was writing about politics and stuff like that on a website. And I found out you could get free books, and so I got this book from Free People's Suicide from Os Guinness that came out with IVP. Pretty philosophical. You'd love it. I know. If you haven't read it, you might really enjoy it. But he convinced me that what matters in our country is really the idea of character, right? So it doesn't matter what our laws say necessarily. It matters whether or not people are willing to abide by those laws and hold each other accountable to them, certainly in the branches of government, but also as citizens. And I started asking myself the question, like, how do you change character? How does that actually work? And I quickly found that it was stories, right? You think about for millennia, how have people in a tribe of people changed or shaped who we are, right? We tell stories about our ancestors, about, as Christians, we do this. We have stories from the Bible. We say, these are the saints. These are the people that we look up to. And so I just said, you know what? I want to start telling stories. I want to get better at that. And so instead of doing something where I was essentially telling people what I think or what they should think, I started pushing into stories. And that's how Halfway There came to be a story show where I'd get people to tell me their stories instead of where I get people to like tell me what we should do or think or say. So that was a big one. One other one, Andrew Clayton was a big one. That was episode 300. I also have gotten to meet some of my high school heroes. I had John Schlett on the show from Petra, which I was a huge Petra fan. I'm kind of a hair band guy. And then I had Jamie Rowe from Guardian also, so it was kind of cool to just meet some people that I never thought I'd be able to meet.
Gotcha. And so kind of bringing that to a dovetail, is there anything that you'd say from your podcast that this has given you some, helped your spiritual journey?
Oh, 100%. So I'll just give you an example right now. Our family, we went through a little bit of church trauma last year for a variety of reasons. Don't have to get into all that. But it's the kind of thing that you'll see a lot of people online talk about, where they're mad at church for whatever reason, mad at a pastor. I don't know, something bad's happened, and they end up checking their faith, right? They end up going, this is not for me. If this group of people doesn't treat me well, or whatever. And we've been through a little bit of that, but I think because of my show, because I've heard so many stories of how God is faithful, of how God leads people in seasons and this way and sometimes that way, and through surprising things and things that you don't even think would turn out to be a good thing. I don't have those same kind of doubts as other people might. It's a season. We're in this interesting, weird season for us right now after COVID. But it's okay because I know, and I have this trust because of all these stories that I've heard. And so, yeah, it absolutely has impacted me. Definitely made me a little more skeptical of some things, made me question some beliefs, and maybe reevaluate them. But ultimately come back to a place of sitting with maybe a contentment with, I don't have to know all the answers, and it's okay for things to be the way they are.
It is certainly a journey. And of course, that brings you back to the matter of character from what you just said on your journey. And that's very interesting. And also another character period for everybody that was developing, that either eroded or built up people, was our experience through the COVID.
Right.
I know from statistics that there was a spike in podcast listeners during the COVID period. Was there, and you mentioned COVID, was there, did you find that there was a good...
yeah, I mean, we're getting to the point.
Content. Was there good stories that came out of the COVID crisis?
Yeah, I mean, we're getting to the point now where people who started things like books or podcasts or other projects during COVID, they're starting to mature, right? So books are being published. People, podcasts are reaching 100 episodes now or more after that. So pretty interesting kind of times. I'm having people on my show who wrote books during COVID, and they had started them like as a project. So that's kind of interesting, definitely.
Fascinating. And you're also the founder of the Christian Podcasters Association. And talking about character and building, Can you tell us a bit about that and how the podcasters are helping each other?
Yeah. So Christian Podcasters Association started in 2017. I decided to start a Facebook group. There really weren't any groups for just Christian podcasters. There's a lot of groups for podcasters in general that do all kinds of different things. And I was in some of those, but somebody asked a question like, hey, are there, they were looking for other groups. And I said, hey, are there any Christian groups? And somebody replied, boy, I'd love it if there were. So I started messaging him. Turned out he was in my hometown of Des Moines, Iowa, which was kind of crazy. And I took that as a sign like, okay, we need to connect. And we decided to start our own Facebook group. He does a whole bunch of other things. And so eventually went away from podcasting, but it was a thing that I did. And now it is we have about 3,200 people, Christian podcasters in the group. In 2020, we started a membership for Christian podcasters where they can come and learn. And so I've got a library of past speakers who come and talk to us. And we meet every Tuesday night and we mastermind and we help each other and we bring in those speakers. You can ask your questions live. But so it's kind of evolved into this thing where I'm able to provide kind of my whole philosophy and thought about how you create a Christian podcast. And in the meantime, in the Facebook group, which I think is what you were asking about, people are helping each other. So what's beautiful about that is we have space for everybody to share every Monday. They can share their latest episodes for the week. But then they can be a guest. There's spots like if you want to be a guest, one of the best things to do is to go on to different shows to help promote your show. So we have things like that. People can ask questions. And then it used to be that I would be the one to answer all the questions, right? But now there's enough people in there. There's enough activity. Often I don't even see questions. People are answering them, and it's grown a little bit bigger than me even.
In addition, you had been an editor with the late Podcast magazine, and this last year you had been a speaker at the Podcast Movement, which some people may not know, but those who are podcasters will know that that's the sort of annual get-together of those who are podcasters from a real wide diversity of podcasts. It's just kind of like everybody. Yep. Which I find interesting, and I like it because you get to have conversations with people across the board and grow in your learning. Can you tell us a little bit about that event and a little bit of picture of the podcast landscape today?
Yeah. So the beautiful thing about podcasting is it's literally everyone, right? So from any walk of life that you can imagine, there is somebody probably making a podcast about it. And they're sharing their life or their content or their worldview or their growth journey. And I just love that. So you'll get people, so I come from a Christian perspective, but you'll get people from lots and lots of different perspectives. And Podcast Movement is one of those places where they'll come together. There's a couple other events throughout the country, but Podcast Movement is kind of my favorite. In fact, this year they're going to be in Denver, my hometown in Denver. So I'm kind of excited. You have an invitation, Dave. You need to come out here, come to it. You should come, but it'll be, it's going to be a great time. I'll never forget my first Podcast Movement was in Orlando in 2019, and just the people I met. Like one time I was standing there looking at a piece of equipment, and dude starts talking to me right next to me, and I'm asking him questions. And then I look at his badge and I find out he's like an old guard podcaster, right? Like he was one of the first guys. So, wow, I had no idea. And so you just kind of get to meet some of the luminaries that are in the space, find out what's going on in the space, learn about monetization and some of the stuff that people want to know about. As for like, where is it heading? It's an interesting time at the moment. I think right now there's a couple problems that people are trying to solve with podcasting, like discoverability. How do people find it? Still, you can't really search audio, although with AI that's getting different, right? So that's starting to change. Everybody wants to know how to monetize, but really some things will never change, like building an audience. Building an audience happens when you serve an audience by showing up on a consistent basis and becoming part of their life, making them think, challenging them, encouraging them, educating them. That's pretty much it. So as much as podcasting might change, that will probably never go away. So these people who you see that have really huge audiences, typically they already started with an audience. And if you're going to start a show, just commit to showing up and you'll find yours.
And we're going to take a brief break, and we will return for the second half of our interview with Eric Nevins. We're back for the second half of our interview with Eric Nevins, the host of Halfway There podcast. Eric, I'd like to ask you, in continuity with what we were talking about podcast creation, what are some critical factors? In this chapter, we like to get into more educational, like people who are interested in learning about how to make podcasts, or those who are interested in podcasts. What are some critical factors in creating a podcast?
Yeah, well, so I like to talk about podcasting as kind of 5 steps. And it does not start where you think it does. So a lot of people, when they start thinking about doing a podcast, they start worrying about getting a microphone, finding hosting. Where does it live? How do I get it out to the world? And all of that is very, very important, but it is not where you start. So I have kind of this 5 parts. And because I went to seminary, I'm contractually obligated to alliterate. So they all start with M. Here it is. So it starts with mindset. I think it matters how you show up. You got to sometimes be willing to do anything to get your content out. For me, early on, that looked like getting an episode out every single Monday and making that decision that was going to happen no matter what. And I had to decide that the show wasn't going to fail because I failed to show up. So that was a really key mindset issue for me, because it can get hard. And when you're publishing often and you feel like nobody's listening, that's a tough place to be. But that commitment, that mindset commitment, will keep you going. The second one is a message. And you really need to have a message about something that you really care about and that will keep you going. So I don't know if you know this, but there's like 600,000 or 700,000 podcasts in iTunes that only have 1 episode, right? So those are the shows, that started
Really,
and somebody didn't know what they were going to say, right? They maybe were playing around with a free app or something to get going, and their phone. I think a lot of that happened during COVID, honestly. But if you don't have a message and you don't have anything to say, you kind of you stop pretty quickly, right? So having your message, knowing the value transformation that you're offering to your audience, and then how you're going to offer that to your audience is really, really critical. And that's when you can get to your what I call the mechanics, the microphones and all that kind of stuff. So I talk about this like it's a house. So your mindset's the foundation. Your message is the framing of the house, the 2x4s that hold everything up. And then the mechanics are like your HVAC and your electrical and your plumbing. Hopefully you never have to think about them, right? You set them up once and then you never think about them. Something's wrong if you're thinking about your plumbing, right? So you hope that never happens. And then marketing I call marketing your curb appeal. It's what attracts people to you and draws people into your space. Can't underestimate the value of that. Super important. And then lastly is monetization. That's what makes your land, whatever you built, your website, productive, and it can turn into a garden or whatever part of the metaphor that you want. But so that's how it really goes. You got to have something that you want to talk about a lot, and that you're not afraid to repeat yourself about, and that you want to create a community around.
great. Thank you very much. And because I want to get a diversity of people on this particular program with this podcast, really the focus is to focus toward people across the spectrum who are life learners, ongoing learners. And what the advice you just gave can be applied to many different areas of endeavors that we do. Thank you very much. Regarding podcast podcast evolving. How is your podcast community evolving?
Yeah, so I think our community is evolving because, well, we're growing. There's certainly more of us. People are also more interested in video. So what you're doing with video is really, really actually kind of cutting edge with what's happening right now. Video. In fact, there was a report last week was actually Podcast Movement. They have a second show in it was in Las Vegas this year, so kind of mid year, and they released some podcasting stats, and video podcasting is like the number one thing that's growing. So people are asking me those questions, and so I'm trying to help them out to figure out how to do that well and inexpensively, right? So there's a lot of that kind of thing, but I think people are more and more committed also to just sharing their message. And so one thing I talk about a lot with my group of Christian podcasters is that the message of Christ that he brings goes out around the world in the next, let's say, century or more through podcasting. It really does. You'll get downloads from all over the world. And it's kind of surprising and amazing and a tremendous opportunity.
Thank you. And please tell us what's ahead for this new year as we're going into the
this year, so for me, it's a kind of a big year. What we're working on, number of things. We have a physical product. We're going to sell a calendar that I'm kind of excited about. I've used it for years, but we're making a custom version for my community, which I think would be kind of fun. I'm offering some tools that are available and will be available on our website, like a self-audit, so that you can go on to get this PDF, look at it, evaluate yourself. It's 91 points. And figure out, what do I actually need to work on next? That's the idea. I think that's one of the most critical things. Is a lot of podcasters just don't get a lot of feedback, especially when you're building your show. It just takes time to get enough people to start to respond to you. And so this gives podcasters a way to figure out what do I actually need to work on? What am I not working on? So things like that. Working on some video, working on a new podcast as well called The Christian Podcaster for Christian podcasters, as you can imagine. And so that's the kind of stuff that I'm working on, trying to develop, and also I'm doing coaching, and I help people guest on podcasts as well. That's a business that's I'm also doing.
We've been talking with Eric Nevins, the host and producer of Halfway There podcast, and the founder of the Christian Podcasters Association. We'd like to thank you, Eric.
Thanks, brother.
Join us for our next episode of the Omnibus Show. We look forward to having you there.
If you enjoyed this program, please like, share, and subscribe to continue the conversation. For the Omnibus Show newsletter, please sign up at theomnibusshow.com.